Chair, given the wide-ranging but within scope nature of this debate that the government whip has indicated, I want to touch on a couple of things that were said in which are germane to this committee stage, which were noted in the last debate. We touched on the fact, a number of points. We said that we would support this piece of legislation. Why? Because we wrote it, and the extensions to it are technical in nature. They simply extend the provisions and the timing provisions for 2 years, which were put in place by the last Labor government. We also noted, sir, and I listened to the debate with interest, we noted, sir, that if this government were serious in respect of how it deals with victims, that the acid test, sir, was not a technical extension to this bill. The acid test, as colleagues on this side of the House have alluded to, is how we deal with victims as a whole, sir. And the most germane example that members on this side used was the lack of resources which have been cauterised by this government in respect of victims of sexual abuse and sexual crime. And I waited and watched, as other members, sir, and I noted Mr Burrow's contribution on 2 points, and I invite the Minister maybe to get up and enlarge on Mr Burrow's point, because what he said, sir, was this. He said that he acknowledged the lack of funding and the denial of funding to victims of sexual crime, and he went on to say, because I wrote it down, this will be a priority for this government. Well, I commend him for the sentiment, but the victims are still waiting. They waited last budget. They waited the budget before. They wait tonight, sitting in dark and cold places, sir, waiting for a government to stump up with some sort of money so that they can get the counselling and the help that they so desperately need. So if it's a priority, I say to the Minister, I'd be very interested to know when, where, which agency, if not ACC, how much, how will the wrongs that this Minister and this government has perpetrated be put right in the denial of funding for victims of sexual crime and sexual abuse. And I listened with interest to the contribution of the ACT Party. Those bastions, of course, who say that they stand beside victims more than anybody else in this Parliament. And was there a contribution? Well, I listened to it very diligently. There was no contribution, sir. No contribution from the ACT members. None. Zip. Silence. What does that say? What does that say, sir? And then I listened to the Maori Party contribution. An interesting one, some fair points, I have to say, about some very tragic and appalling circumstances many years ago. But I also waited for that Minister and that support party to get up and also say, well, hang on, we think the government that we aid and abet every day has done wrong by pulling the rug out from people victims of sexual crime and abuse by cutting their funding, by not allowing them to get, sir, the help that they got under the last government. Not a word. Oh no, that'd be a bit of a tough one, wouldn't it? That'd be a tough one, to grit your teeth, stand up and criticise the governing party that stands over you every day and demands your vote and demands your support and demands your accountability. What about the Maori victims of sexual crime who are denied funding under this government? Did we hear that Minister and the co-leader of the Maori Party stand up for her constituents and the constituents that her party purports to represent and say it is wrong that her constituents, who are victims of heinous and tragic crimes that live with it every day, are denied funding that they need because of this government? Oh no, that'd be a bit tough, wouldn't it? Oh no, we can talk about history, we can talk about other injustices which occur and we pay respect to them, but oh no, bit meek, bit mild to stand up, bit tough to stand up and say we don't agree with what they've done. So I challenge Ms Turia and Mr Boscawen and others who are very silent on this issue because of course they aid and abet the injustice every day perpetrated by that party. I say to that party that every victim, and I acknowledge at least Mr Burrows addressed the issue. At least he said it would be a priority for the government in the future. The difficulty Mr Burrows has, of course, is he doesn't sit in Cabinet. Maybe he should, because at least he's prepared to address it in the debate, sir. Maybe he should. But his Cabinet colleagues every day on a Monday morning sit there and do nothing about it. Do nothing about it, sir. So I say to Mr Burrows, good on you. You said it would be a priority, sir, through you, Mr Chair.
The Honourable Clayton Cosgrave.
Mr Burrows said it would be a priority for this government. And maybe, and I take him at his word, that he's knocking down a few doors of Nick Smith's office and other colleagues and saying, what does priority mean? When, where, what agency, how much, when are we going to help these people? But I challenge every member over there to stand up and tell us what they will do to assist the victims of sexual abuse and sexual crime who now, because of their government, their vote, their aiding and abetting of their party, when those constituents, Mr Bakshi and others, when they will actually get assistance. And it's not good enough to say it'll be a priority in the future. I say again, these people waited in the budget before last. These people waited in the budget we've just had, and tonight and every night this week and next month and the months after, they wait and they have their own nightmare every day and every night as they live with what was done to them, and they live with the fact that they cannot, because they do not have the means, cannot access the resources that they desperately need. Even though there's somebody probably in the clink, and there is no dispute that a crime was perpetrated against them, there's somebody in the clink and a verdict that said they were done over, assaulted, maligned, treated tragically and disreputably. No one disputes that. The only thing we have today, and this is where the acid test is, not this piece of legislation. This piece of legislation is about extending what we did when we were in government. The acid test is as to whether you are committed, as I've said before, to assisting the victims and the most vulnerable, is what are you going to do about those victims whose funding those members over there in that government cauterised? Oh no. You could hear a pin drop in here, couldn't you? Not a word. Not a word. And I wager that there are, the member smiles, Ms Turia smiles. Well, I say this to Ms Turia. I say, when the member does her next clinic, and she has a member of her constituency, Maori or Pākehā, who walks into her office as she grins away at me, come in and say, I need help, I was raped, I was assaulted, I was abused, and I cannot get assistance that I had in years past because of the vote that that member and her ilk give that government every day. I wonder if Ms Turia will sit there quietly and meek and mildly, as she does in that sort of Mother Teresa-like way, and grin at that constituent. I wonder if she will. I think better of that member, actually. I suspect she won't. But again, the acid test, she is a minister. She has incredible power. She has the power, actually, as a coalition partner, to not only stamp her feet to say, we're out of here, we're not going to tolerate this, but oh no, like lambs to the proverbial, to use the biblical phrase, like lambs to the proverbial slaughter. Well, I say to Ms Turia and Mr Boscawen and Mr Garrett and the Sensible Sentencing Trust that those who stay silent and do not protest this injustice of protecting the most vulnerable, those who stay silent and bear witness to it, then those people will have to be accountable to their various constituencies, both at an election and in other places and other times. And I say to the Minister and the Chair, I would invite him to deal with Mr Burrows' pertinent point. He said this will be a priority for the government. Well, I invite him to get up, we'll give him as long as he wants, and tell us when this injustice will be righted, when the money will flow and become available, what agency will administer it, and when these poor folk who live with it every day, every night, and as my colleague, I think it was Lynn Pillay, said, some who are no longer with us because they have taken their own lives because they cannot cope, they cannot deal with this crime that has been perpetrated against them, and they receive no assistance from this government. How many lives could we have saved if we had ensured, despite the bureaucratic bickering over there from Nick Smith and others, if we'd ensured to hell with it, these people will get the assistance they need? How many lives could we have saved of victims? So I say to people who sort of get up and make lofty statements about victims, here's where the rubber hits the road. Here's where the rubber hits the road. And we will wait and see what happens in the lead up to the next election, because all of us, I suspect, on all sides of the House have had victims of these crimes come to us in terrible circumstances, begging for assistance. They should not have to beg, sir. The government of which they are governed by in this country is there to assist them